If the first two parables were surprising, the third one, as familiar as it is about the so-called prodigal son, is all the more surprising. Something very surprising happens at the table right at the start. A man had two sons, and the younger one said to his father, presumably it was a setting, like they're gathered at the dinner table, Father, give me the share of the estate that should come to me. Now that's a shocker. We might just hear, oh yeah, that's the way it begins. But no, there's a huge surprise there in that culture for a son to say, Dad, you've been taking good care of yourself, even though we don't have Ma around here anymore. You're going to last a long time, and I'd really like my inheritance right now. Well, that would be an insult, and the whole neighborhood would hear about that pretty soon, and they wouldn't even allow a kid who disrespects his father to that extent. He wants the money to grab it right now and have a good time with it. But that's not it. That's the second surprise is the old man actually does it. Yes, he tells his elder son, well, you get 2/3, of course, and the kid, he gets 1/3. But you want it that way, you got it that way. And what happens? Well, the younger son grabs his part and leaves. He sets off to a distant country where he squandered his inheritance on a life of dissipation. We don't know what that means, but he spent it all. And another country means he goes to a Gentile territory. He's no longer in Judea. And now what? Well, he's not allowed back. That's the culture. He's not allowed back after he's insulted his father that way and taken good Jewish money and spent it in another place. And he set out to the man's farm to take care of the pigs. You remember that comes next. He hires himself out to earn some money. But he gets hungry because nobody gives him anything to eat. Why the Gentile landowner is so cruel, we don't know. But the fact is, he's given nothing to eat, and he cannot eat what's offered to the pigs. So he's got to figure out a way of getting back home. No longer as a member of the family, but just as a worker. And we see him plan on that. How many of my father's hired workers would have more than enough to eat, and here I am, dying from hunger. So, and then we hear him make his plan. Well, I'll get up and go to my father, and I'll say to him, Father, I've sinned against heaven and against you. No longer deserve to be called and treated as your son, so I'll just be one of the workers. I'll live somewhere else. I'll report. I'll do my work. But at least I'll have some food. I won't die. So he got up and went back to his father. And listen to the way Luke describes the father. While he was still a long way off, his father caught sight of him, was filled with compassion. He ran to his son, embraced him, and kissed him. Now, that behavior of the father is very surprising. A mature man, the father of sons, does not run. He walks around in his robes, real cool. And notice, where are his eyes? On the horizon. He sees the kid coming over the horizon and runs out to meet him That's not the behavior of a mature man in that culture. And he kisses him, so he's very demonstrative. And everybody would be really amazed at his behavior. This man really cares about his kid, no matter how badly he behaved according to cultural norms. The servants are standing around there. They're watching to see, well, what's the father going to do now? The kid deserves a good whacking. But instead, what do they hear? They hear the father say, now quickly, get the finest robe and put it on him, and take the fattened calf and slaughter it. You know, this is not beef country. They only have a feast on a fatted calf if it's a really, really big party, and you have to eat the whole thing. There's no refrigeration to keep what's left over. And you got to invite everybody in town, because it takes all those people to be included and consume the animal, because you need some help with that. So the father's created a scene that involves everybody. They all got to go along with what's going to turn out to be his welcome, because he's already said, bring out the best robe. Well, that's his own best robe, and a ring. Well, that's like the family signet. I mean, he's the younger child, and yet he gives what the older child should have. But no, the younger child gets it. His compassion is very spontaneous. The celebration began. And there is son number 2, isn't there? He comes in from the field. Apparently he's working the property. It's his now, because he's the heir. The father gave the whole thing to the 2 sons. The older son comes up and says, well, what does this mean? The sound of music and dancing and celebration? And the servant says, well, your brother has returned, and your father has slaughtered the fat calf, because he has him back, safe and sound. Notice the servant uses the family language. He's talking about your father, your brother. These are relationships that the elder son ought to recognize spontaneously. And he became angry, the elder son, when he hears about this. And when he refused to enter the house, he's not going to have any part of it, even though he surely ought to go along with at least collaborating with his dad and welcoming his brother back. But look at the language that comes out of the son's mouth. He said to his father in reply, all these years I've slaved for you. That's actually what the Greek word said. This translation says served you, but it's douluo. It's the word for slave, to act like a slave. And not once did I disobey any of your commands. That's language that's used for the commandments. So he's talking to his father with the respect you'd give to God, yes. But what kind of a relationship is it? Slave to master? That is very weird, culturally. When your son, he doesn't say Alfie or whatever his brother's name is. He's like he's not connected with his own brother. He says, your son returns, who swallowed up your property with prostitutes. Now, how does he know that? I guess he thinks he's that kind of a kid. Well, maybe so, but he doesn't know. He just assumes it. So he says to him, the father does, well, and the climax is, for him, you slaughter the fattened calf. In other words, you make a special meal when he comes home. And the dad says, my son. Notice, he acknowledges the father-son relationship. the same one he has with the younger son. My son, you're here with me always. And everything I have is yours. Yeah, he split the property between the two, remember? But now we must celebrate and rejoice because your brother, not, my son, but your brother was dead and has come to life again. I mean, he really was good as dead because he had nothing to eat. But he was lost and has been found. It connects it with all those other parables, doesn't it? This really should be called the two lost sons, right? And remember the audience that Jesus named for us at the very beginning of the parable? The scribes and the Pharisees, the tax collectors, the sinners. How do you suppose those members of the audience responded to this part of the story? Would they identify with any of them? It sure sounds like Pharisaical language, doesn't it? When he says we've slaved, we've never disobeyed any of your commandments. It sounds like extreme Pharisees, not normal Pharisees, but extreme ones who insist that the main thing about life is a slave-master relationship with God. They've got it all wrong. And the scribes and Pharisees, the tax collectors and sinners, the people who are not included because they're suspected or resented by their Jewish brothers and sisters because they're working for the government, the Romans. What would they think? My God, they'd say, look at this Jesus. He welcomes, us, people like us. So they'd be impressed. There's something in here for everybody. Both sons were lost each in their own way. This is all about a father who is compassionate and wants to include both sons, and not just both sons, everybody. Notice how those details all fold together. And how much more we understand when it's not just about the so-called prodigal son, the runaway. It's about, all of us. And we can all find a place in this story.
So, Dennis, does the older son then correspond to the legalistic scribes and Pharisees?
Exactly. Yes, they're extreme types. They're not your normal Pharisees who are generally good guys, but they're rather extreme. But they're described in such a way that whoever is listening to this Lucan version of a familiar story has got to identify, where do I fit in here? Do any one of these characters speak to me and remind me of some qualities in my own life that need to be challenged? See, Luke's way of telling it really does provide application because you can't help but relate. We don't hear how the elder son finally responds. Neither get kicked out of the family, of course. God's compassion is universal. It's up to us to respond.
And how does this parable, this longer parable, kind of sum up the two short parables that went before in chapter 15?
In each case, it is a description of what all this means to God. and what it means to follow Jesus. If you want to follow Jesus, you've got to count the cost. You've got to allow yourself to be found by a compassionate God. You've got to give nothing less. And my point was really about what Luke the teller, how Luke the teller of the stories draws us into the big subject of how to be a disciple. You want to follow Jesus, you're dealing with this kind of a God. And it's offered to everybody, that kind of compassion. But it demands something special of those who want to follow Jesus, who understand what he's asking.
And of course, Luke is the only one who has the words of Jesus on the cross, right? Father, forgive them. That would be an expression of the same kind of love and mercy. Father, forgive
Absolutely,
them.
yes, and Jesus is asking you to take everything personally, all of your relationships. Following Jesus means to take everything as personally as God the Father does, as portrayed by Jesus, these stories of Jesus.